So the theme of our second section is conformity and rebellion. Now this is a really common topic that shows up in a lot of literature. I mean, really, the idea of a plot is that you have to have conflict, right? And so you have the rising action, as I've explained elsewhere. You have the rising action, and you have a protagonist who's very frequently blocked by another person, right, the antagonist, or even an entire kind of system, right? Either a social system, a governmental system, a psychological system, whatever it is. And so this idea of conformity and rebellion is really important and really central to a lot of what literature does. I'm starting you off with a couple of stories that you may read and find very, very strange. And that's part of the purpose of those stories, that a lot of what we read in literature is about strangeness, or things that make us feel strange or odd as we read them, because really what literature is doing is sort of shaking us out of our normal patterns of thinking. Right, our normal expectations about the world, and that's what makes it interesting and makes it complicated and makes it sort of honestly kind of the fun of the interpretive experience, is to figure out that strangeness, that it decenters us from our expectations. And so with Bartleby the Scrivener, a couple of things about this to note: that the story is published in 1853, and so in some ways the language is going to feel very different from what you're used to reading, and the characters are, obviously very 19th century characters. In a lot of ways, it's very much a story about the 19th century, right? But it is also in many ways a story that we can still think about now, and how we can consider conformity, because the story is really about a man, the narrator, right? So this persona who is a lawyer. I mean, he's just not a very interesting lawyer, and we can think about it from his point of view, right? He tells us all about himself. He has this tendency to sort of self-aggrandize, that he likes to drop names, right? He talks about John Jacob Astor, who is this very important, very wealthy, rich New Yorker, right? And so this is, I mean, that would be the equivalent of now dropping names about, contemporary politicians or really famous people, right? If I'm going to talk about, I'm just a real estate lawyer, but I totally had my client Beyonce, right? Like dropping that name in there to show, no, I'm really, I'm close to famous people. I'm not famous myself. I live a very ordinary life, but I know people, right? And so that's sort of who our narrator is. But he is a man of habits and a man of expectations. And so he encounters this very odd fellow, this really strange dude, Bartleby, right? Who when we meet him, he's pitiably neat, he's pallid, right? So he's pale, he's very, very strange. So even that, the narrator's initial response to him tells us a lot actually about the narrator, much more than about Bartleby. And so as you read the story, think about the different ways characters react to Bartleby, characters respond to Bartleby, and what characters expect of him. Bartleby's response, right? He begins as a copyist, right? And so this is 19th century, so there are no photocopiers, that if you need copies of things, you hire people to write them, right? So that's what a scrivener is, and that is the job that Bartleby has. And we can think about how boring and how difficult and tedious that job is. And Bartleby's own resistance is simply to prefer not to. And I want you to think about what that really means, and what that means to follow through on that. I would prefer not to do this thing. Right? And so this story is one that really, in many ways, highlights the pain of conformity, right? The sort of driving force that insists that we conform to a certain system, to a certain set of expectations of what we do. And Bartleby's resistance is quiet, right? And that's what's really unnerving about the story, and unnerving about Bartleby, is that it's not a loud resistance. When we think about rebellion, right? If we think about rebellion and revolution, we are often talking about things that are much louder, that are much often violent, right? And certainly not this sort of quiet rebellion of Bartleby. And so we can think about the way that the narrator of this story is sort of discomforted by Bartleby, is sent out of sorts by Bartleby, but it also forces him to change, right? And so think about that as you read this story. I'm going to post some videos of some of these things, right, that I've talked about before. The page numbers may not match because I was working out of a different edition, but you will have some things to think about, and they will give you some ideas there. And like I said, all right, so weirdness is a big part of this. So weirdness is also a huge part of Kafka. In general, when we talk about Kafka, I think that's the first thing people think is Kafka's weirdness. All right, if you've read Kafka's Metamorphosis, it is about a man who the opening line is simply that he wakes up as a giant vermin, right? And most often people translate that to mean some sort of giant bug. Right? And that's the beginning of the story. That's not the climax of the story. That's just the opening line, right? And so that Gregor Samsa, upon awakening, right, was a giant vermin. And so that's a lot of what Kafka does, right, is he upends our expectations, right? Because that's what literature is here to do. It upends our expectations, upends the way we view the world and we understand the world. The same is true with the hunger artist. Excuse me, I should say a hunger artist. And I want you to think about why you would say a hunger artist rather than the hunger artist, right? What's the difference? What's the difference? An emphasis on that. But here is a story published in 1924, right? So it's almost 100 years old, and it gives us a very specific perspective on what was an actual type of profession once upon a time in freak shows. People who would indeed sit and starve themselves. But it really becomes a metaphor for something else. As with Bartleby, in many ways it criticizes capitalism, that it's criticizing commercialism and commercialization of art. And so you have this artist who is so proud of what he's doing, and no one really believes that he's actually doing it all himself, that he's faking, right? And so that he eventually, right, dies for his art and is never really satisfied. And his answer as to why he does this, right, because I could find no food that I liked, right, tells us something about sort of this compelling need when one is an artist. And so that's part of what we can think about. Now, those are not the only ways to think about it, right? But your questions will ask you, right, and the first question even asked tells you, many see this as a parable of the artist in the modern world, right? Others see it as a religious parable. How can it be either of those? And so think about those questions as you're doing this. Again, I go back to this idea of weirdness, and sort of it disorients us. It sort of shakes us out of our expectations of things, and that's the point, right? We want things to do that. That's what literature does. We don't want it to simply confirm our pre-existing expectations. We don't want it to confirm all of our values simply, as they are. We want it to challenge us. We want it to sort of shake us loose from the way we sort of have gotten to think habitually, right? And so those stories in particular will do it, but this whole idea of conformity and rebellion in everything you look at should help you sort of expand your understanding of people's relationship to society, right? That's very much what rebellion is about. That's extraordinarily what conformity is about, right? Conformity is all about fitting into society. And how do these stories approach that idea? Do they affirm that, right? Do the stories, the poems, the play affirm the idea of conformity? What are the dangers of conformity? What are the dangers of rebellion, right? What's the positive aspect of rebellion? You can think about all of those things with any of these pieces that we're reading for this week.